Cool. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the November data facing call for CARC. That would be the Campus Research Computing Consortium. With more information on your screen right now, we have two parts to CARC: the People Network, which is year-round virtual conferences on various topics. Then we also have some working and interest groups that focus around some actual deliverables. For example, the capabilities model for research, computing, and data, which is developed by CARC to help institutions benchmark their services against other institutions. I would also like to note that we do have an official code of conduct. There is a big link to it up at the top of the page. Especially for today, I would like to point out that part of the code is to be respectful of different viewpoints and experiences. And if you do violate that, we will ask you to leave. If anyone experiences some troublesome behavior, on the link to the code of conduct, there's also a form to report that. So just go ahead and let us know. So for December, we will not have a data facing meeting at our normal time, but there will be kind of an end of year party where you'll have the choice of going to breakout rooms. Some of them are work related, to discuss the working and interest groups, but then there's also going to be fun stuff like games, like maybe Among Us, for example. So that ought to be fun. And then last announcement, we are still looking for folks to help on the steering committee for data facing. This would involve just kind of organizational aspects like getting topics, introducing calls, finding speakers, all of that. If you are interested, please email df-coordinators@carc.org. Cool. And now let us get on to the talk. Today our speaker is AJ Millian. He is the director of the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data at the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research at the University of Michigan. So in 2017, he earned his PhD in Information Science and Learning Technologies from the University of Missouri, where his dissertation tested the relationship between forms of bureaucratic organization and innovation in U.S. State Department of Transportation websites. AJ's research examines how and why public sector organizations use information technologies, among other topics. And some of these include scholarly communication, research data management, and public administration. Before joining ICPSR, AJ was a postdoctoral fellow in the School of Information at the University of Michigan and a research librarian for the Missouri Department of Transportation. Now I will hand it over to AJ.
Thanks, Deb. All right, I should have my slides up now. Can everybody see things just fine? I'm assuming so. Okay, all right, so Deb's already given me an introduction, so no need to introduce myself, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the state of firearm infrastructure in the United States. And instead of kind of just taking a very kind of technical approach to it, although there will be some of my presentation that will talk about that, what I'm really going to do is kind of start with a bit of a personal lead in and just kind of based off my experiences and kind of discuss some of the implications of us not having the best firearm infrastructure we possibly could have. Most of my assessments are going to be value neutral, or at least to the extent that's possible. And some of what I'm going to talk about today is a little fraud. It's always political and contentious to talk about firearms in the United States, but I'm going to look at it from more of a public health perspective and just in terms of the data that's accessible and talk about why I think that matters. So to provide a little bit of background information, I'm the director of MacJD at the University of Michigan, and I'm originally from Missouri. I graduated from the University of Missouri in 2017 and Drury University in 2006. And my training is as an information scientist. I am not a criminologist, and I'm not primarily concerned in my own research at looking at things like firearm violence or racial inequity or things of that matter. I usually look at systems, and to some extent the people who are involved with them as well, and who run them. In any case, something I think to bring up that I think dovetails with today's presentation, and I think everybody kind of knows a little bit about this, is while I was at the University of Missouri, there were big, large protests over the shooting of Michael Brown. Michael Brown was a recent high school graduate. He was unfortunately killed during a stop. There was some sort of altercation. And regardless of the details of it, it basically set off a powder keg that was in the area. Also at the university at the time, not long afterwards, there were student protests over some basically racially charged events on campus that probably weren't handled as well by the administration as they could have been. The graduate students unionized, and many of the protesters were from the St. Louis area. So just the circumstances surrounding the period wherever there was a little fraught, and it caught a lot of people off guard because we hadn't really seen that at Mizzou before. So I'm bringing this up because I know a little bit about Ferguson and the North St. Louis County area because I used to live in the metro area. And, like a lot of cities in the United States, it has a history of segregation, lending discrimination, and redlining. North St. Louis County especially dealt with white flight, and as a result of that, declining police budgets and municipal budgets. And one of the real negative effects of this, among many others, is that police departments raised funding by issuing traffic citations and adopting basically all these approaches that would basically fund themselves, which caused increased declining trust with the police, which, to be perfectly honest, wasn't as good as it probably could have been in the first place. So after Michael Brown was shot, it set off a powder keg. And what this did is it raised the national visibility of Black Lives Matter. There were obviously many other things that contributed to Black Lives Matter kind of growing as a group in the country. But at Ferguson, this is one of the early instances where it got a bunch of national recognition. Now, I'm bringing this up because the conditions that set off the protests in Ferguson aren't particularly unique. It's a sobering fact, but when I was doing some research to prepare for this presentation, I found that about 1 in every 1,000 Black men will be killed by the police in their lifetimes. And I don't want to cherry pick any figures, but that's, I think, about 3 times higher either than the average or for a white man. And in that sort of circumstances, you can understand how there would be a lot of concerns about policing. There are historical roots to this. I can't really go into them, but it's not my space to really tangle with and engage all of that, but it is an unfortunate reality. And, as the instance with George Floyd in Minneapolis shows, things haven't necessarily gotten a whole lot better since 2014. There's a lot of discussions among criminologists and among police departments about reform and what criminal justice reform might look like. But this is something to where if you paid attention to the news over the past 10 years, it's been around. And it's unfortunately something that we deal with in the United States. So I bring this, or show you this picture here because setting aside the racial issue, firearms are closely linked to many of the events that I've talked about. Police carry firearms. There are questions about individuals who are perfectly peaceful, who own firearms for self-defense. And setting aside all these complex issues that I'm talking about, I think something that's really important to keep in mind here is that regardless of the political dimensions of all these things that we hear about in the news today, it's just the reality that firearms very often relate to public health. They have an impact on it. A study in 2018 using data from the Institute of Health and Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington found that the US is unique among high-income countries. We rank 8th in firearm homicides. There are 2 US territories ranked higher, but they're first and third on the list. But when you look at countries with more than 10 million residents, the US comes in first. So firearm-related homicides in the US are disproportionately high, especially among high-income countries. Now, I don't want to overstate the case here or just say guns are bad or be that black and white, because the debate, I think, and the evidence really doesn't bear that out. Other countries, for example, have much worse firearm homicide rates. For example, these tend to be in Central America or the Caribbean, where gangs and drug trafficking are problems. And so the US, for all its issues, doesn't necessarily, it's easy to look at the headlines in the news and misconstrue things. Now that said, stepping back, connecting to Ferguson and what I talked about earlier, African Americans or Blacks in the United States are twice as likely to die due to firearms, and other minority communities often deal with the implications of widespread firearm access as well. But then when you factor out things like gang and drug-related violence, we still find that the US gun homicide rate is comparatively high. So why is this the case? Well, there are lots of reasons, but I think a good way to think of this is to simply just say that the influence of guns on public health intersects with race and other demographic categories. So guns aren't a cause necessarily, they don't have agency, but they are a tool that people have, and they can be used for multiple purposes, but and for much more than just self-defense or to rob people or do things like that. But their use does have consequences, and some demographic groups see the results of those consequences more often. So kind of talking a little bit more about the implications of the particularly unique American environment as it relates to firearms. We hear a lot about mass shootings. No standard definition of this exists, but the Gun Violence Archive reported there are 571 this year. And the media tends to downplay other deaths and injuries, but mass shootings actually aren't nearly as common as the media might like us to believe, as tragic as they are. When you look at other types of shootings, though, we see that there are a lot of homicides, but they only accounted for about 37% of firearm-related deaths. They account for about 75% of homicides. But something that's really worth noting here is that most firearm deaths are actually suicides. They relate to mental health issues or other things of the sort. And the US actually has low rates of assaulted violence and a high firearm mortality rates, which basically tells us the issue here isn't just a matter of good guys with guns or bad guys with guns or anything like that. It's actually related to mental health, and guns are used in particular environments. And there's a lot going on here, and there are a lot of people out there who do own guns, who are responsible gun owners who keep them locked up and aren't really to blame for kind of this larger environment. But kind of stepping back and looking at this a little more broadly and taking this nuanced view that I'm taking, we have to remember that correlation is not causation. And as the saying goes, guns don't necessarily kill people, people kill people. But because we have a high rate of gun ownership in the United States, and because of a confluence of other factors like the war on drugs and 9/11, and then also there's, talk about an assault rifle ban, or that happened in, I think it passed in the 90s, and then it was repealed in the aughts under the Bush administration. This can sometimes create a bit of an arms race with police departments. And so the climate that we have here in the United States related to the Second Amendment, firearm ownership, different cultures having different attitudes about guns, and on top of that, racial issues, basically means that we're in a situation that it more or less creates this environment where, well, it makes sense that we would have more firearm related deaths than other countries where ownership isn't quite as high. So something also kind of worth noting here, if you dig into the numbers, you find out that individuals with risk factors are less likely to safely store their firearms when compared to firearm owners. And this lends some credence to the responsible gun owner argument. So I'm going to offer some thoughts. Gun ownership is protected by the Second Amendment, and it is a right. And in Congress, conservatives in general are wary of research, or historically have been wary of research being used to regulate or over-regulate this right. And so that's one perspective on this. And setting that aside, something that we do know, regardless of whether research examining gun violence is a good thing or a bad thing or how it's used, the fact of the matter is that it's actually kind of hard to study gun violence in the United States, and our infrastructure isn't as well developed as it could potentially be. For example, there's no national gun registry in the US. And until recently, the Dickey Amendment said that no money could be used to study injury prevention, or no money that's meant to study injury prevention. And again, this is from a public health perspective, not from an advocacy perspective. No federal dollars could be used to promote gun control. So it's undeniable that guns do influence public health, or can influence public health, because they're the primary means of suicide, homicide, and a lot of people are shot, like in the US each day. But at the same time, the how and why and when, all of the questions that we have to answer to think about crafting interventions, but at the same time protecting gun rights, that's really hard to answer. We don't really have the best infrastructure and the best data available to figure out how we could do that. And, that creates some challenges, especially for people who study it and are trying to come up with solutions that can potentially have an impact. Okay, so now that I've kind of covered the hard stuff to talk about, which I think everybody already has a sense of, I'd like to spend today's discussion mostly talking about the data infrastructure in the United States, because this is kind of the space where I think we're probably best positioned to learn and to kind of get an understanding of the lie of the land. And, if we can set aside some of these broader debates, we can just focus on what we know and how we collect evidence, basically, to make claims about firearms related use and injuries and fatalities in the United States. Then I think that'd probably be a really productive way to kind of approach the issue. So research relating to firearms data that uses our existing data infrastructure, and I'm using the term very broadly, usually takes place in crime and criminal justice or public health. But it doesn't happen in one single area. And the data is collected in these two domains, so either through the Department of Justice or the CDC or different federal agencies. And work is basically needed in both areas to produce targeted and effective interventions that can save lives. But as a consequence of it being split up by research area, infrastructure is incredibly fragmented. So at the federal level, data primarily comes from the Department of Justice, the Centers for Disease Control, and NIH-funded work. But on top of that, the US is a federal democratic republic with multiple levels. You have the state, local, and federal levels of government, plus the three branches, the executive, judiciary, and legislative branches. Basically, all this means that data availability depends on local structures, resources, and priorities. And so we don't approach this in a consistent, uniform manner. The federal government tries, but it has limited capacity to do this. And it creates coordination problems, basically. There are gaps in data collection and dissemination nationally. The data that we have is useful, but there are limits to it. And then we have this larger kind of climate that also kind of exacerbates things. And this, in a lot of ways, explains why it's so difficult to do things related to firearms injury and guns in the United States, short of just reducing things into binary discussions about, well, guns are good or guns are bad. So what are some of these gaps in terms of what we know? Well, there's an expert panel on firearms data that was recently convened by the National Opinion Research Center in Chicago with the support of Arnold Ventures. And what they did is they evaluated firearms data sources in the United States. And they created this conceptual framework and blueprint for a potential infrastructure that could be used in the US. I was not on this committee. I am aware of it because of the work that I do in an adjacent space. But reading through it, I noticed that a lot of the data contained or referenced in this blueprint actually came back to my archive in a lot of ways. And I'm not condoning or saying what they're doing is good or bad. I'm just kind of recognizing it. But their conclusion was that an integrated national system with public health and criminal justice data just isn't feasible to build right now. So what they focus on doing is offering up small incremental small changes that provide a clear path to implementation that could improve the state of the data that we have available as a country. And that's what I'm going to focus the rest of my presentation on, and talk about the nuts and bolts of how we know what we know and where it's collected, and then hopefully connect it back to why I think it matters and everybody can agree on that. So let's talk about the potential changes that were outlined in this report. At the federal level, one recommendation was to create a reliable administrative data system, or reliable systems, for tracking non-fatal gunshot injuries. So when people are shot and killed, we have ways to collect that. But if somebody gets shot and injured, it's not necessarily going to be captured. There's no reliable administrative data system in the US that tracks this. And I think we all can agree that, fatalities, as bad as they are, injuries also matter too. And if we don't know how many people are injured, or where, or why, or what their demographic characteristics are, or what the risk factors are, it's going to make it even harder for us to figure out how to stop things from happening before they even get worse, which is when fatalities occur. The CDC it's called NICE. It's a surveillance system. Basically, it's connected to medical records in the US. And this data set, which is in my archive, it produces firearms related injury estimates, but research suggests that these national figures aren't reliable because of sampling and classification issues. As an aside, the FBI has something called the UCR. So it's the Uniform Crime Reports program, and it reports state level totals on firearms related crime, but not other types of injuries. And it doesn't really say much about the details of this crime. And then there's this other program that the FBI provides. It's called NIBRS, so that it's a national incident-based reporting system. And what it does is it collects incident-based crime reports at the local level. So if I were to have my car broken into in Ann Arbor, Michigan on a Wednesday night, the police department would collect this information, put it into a national system. It would go to Washington, D.C., then it would come back to Michigan where it get cleaned up, and then we'd provide it in the data archive. Well, this is great information to have, but unfortunately, not all agencies in the US participate. So as a consequence of this, you have major cities, small municipalities, like sometimes large chunks of states, just not sending data to DC. So when you hear about crime going up or crime going down, our national incident level detail, of crime, is not always available. And the truth of the matter is we don't know what we don't know. So obviously addressing the issue that I mentioned earlier could drive some changes that would tell us more about the firearm infrastructure in the US and firearm related injuries and fatalities. But there are a lot of other things that could be done too, according to the report that I'm talking about. The federal government could provide assistance for law enforcement agencies to contribute to NIBRS. So what that would do is hopefully increase the percentage of federal agencies, or not federal agencies, state and local agencies that contribute data to the federal government that researchers can use. This isn't even necessarily just about providing it to the federal government, though. It's also about single data sources, because usually the federal government acts as the collector of data of this sort in the US, and researchers usually tend to go to them because, as you might imagine, trying to survey all 50 states and all the municipalities within them to collect this data is a huge undertaking, and the federal government's well positioned to do this. Another thing that could be done is that there could be a funded annual national survey of firearms ownership, acquisition, and storage practices. So this may be controversial among some groups who, again, are wary of research into this area, seeing it as justification for regulation. But we don't have a national survey of who owns what, even at the aggregate level, protecting individuals' rights. And we don't necessarily always know how firearms are acquired or storage practices. I'm not saying there's not data out there, but we just don't have the big picture overview that we kind of need to understand the true state of things in the US. Individual federal agencies don't always coordinate with one another on this matter. So there's the possibility of creating a federal data sharing platform so they know what's available among different agencies. And another proposal that I would argue is probably important based off my experience working with the federal government, although it always depends on priorities in Washington, DC, and where time can be spent. There's the possibility of setting up a working group to address infrastructure gaps. The catch with this is it would need executive level support, and getting support from a president or any elected official on this matter is obviously going to be fraught, and it's going to take time. Another thing that could be done is to create guidance to improve the timeliness of federal data releases. As a case in point, like I know the federal agencies that I work with work really hard to get data out in a timely manner and make it accessible to the research community. But if I recall, OMB isn't or hasn't issued guidance requirements for federal agencies to improve timeliness. So this is an executive issue. It's basically something saying we need to get this data out faster, and like it needs to be, within a couple of years or a year of data coming out, because that doesn't always happen. As a case in point, some of the data in my archive lags about a year or two. And this probably would have been a little more acceptable, or everybody would have been happier with it, in the mid 90s, or when data collection methods were, manual. But today, now that things are digital, it's arguable. I'm not going to say whether it is the case or not, but it's arguable that data creation and collection and dissemination could be faster. Some other issues with our national infrastructure. In some cases, data is not accessible. Some of the data in my archive contains direct and indirect identifiers, so it's restricted. This was something mentioned in the report, and figuring out how to make firearm related data available to researchers and journalists and people who want it in a way that we also protect individuals, personal information is a challenge. So finding ways to increase accessibility could go a long way. The report also calls for guidance to improve the consistency and timeliness of individual criminal background checks, and also, to create guidance for supporting and developing data collection use agreements. There are about 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the US plus courts. And when you think about things like criminal background checks or, developing data collection use agreements, there are always these questions about if you collect data from people who buy firearms or report this information, how it's being used, how we know it's being protected, and basically doing that in an efficient way. So you have to balance data collection with people's right to privacy, or their right not to be identified, which of course ties into other things as well. And it's also complicated by the fact that sometimes, very often, actually, some groups do not trust government agencies with collecting this data. So that creates another layer of challenges. And in many ways is kind of similar to questions relating to Donald Trump's tax releases, and how that could have been made available to the public or not. That information, if I recall correctly, a lot of it was confidential. The IRS had some of this protected, and there are laws in place that basically protect that sort of information. So figuring out how we can simultaneously collect data from state and local agencies relating to people's personal property, which is firearms, their use, and also conducting criminal background checks and all of this, there's definitely a data sensitivity issue. And finding ways to harmonize that and create systems that collect this information and let researchers use it, but don't cause harm. It's a challenge. It's something that is not insignificant. And then some additional changes that could be made is, developing resources for local governments to integrate health, social service, crime, and other data together. So this isn't just about guns. This is actually about, risk factors like mental health, poverty, other things along those lines, past criminal records, figuring out whether people get injured as opposed to just killed. So you need a much more expansive set of data to really look at this from a public health perspective. And sometimes local governments just don't have the resources or the ability to integrate all these tools together that they could provide, to the federal government or to individual researchers. It's just really hard to get it all together. And so that's a challenge we have if we are going to tackle this as a public health issue, which is the argument that's being made by this report. More changes, I've listed a ton of them, but we can make improvements to existing data sets. For example, the NIBRS data set, which I've talked about, it needs a subcategory for weapons charges, gunshot wounds, and domestic violence. Sometimes simple things like coding schema for a data set, like in how things are shared and saved, causes limitations for researchers downstream. The survey of prison inmates, it's a survey of prisoners that includes information about why they're incarcerated. This could be updated to collect firearms related information. And it could include information about how they obtained firearms, which caused them to be incarcerated. But we don't currently have this information available. Other federal agencies, of course, could integrate and coordinate to create a combined data set to determine what's available, because we just don't have that at the time. And then finally, last, there's this issue of state and local governments, which I talked about, and I'm going to skip over it. But just remember again that the US is a federal constitutional republic that delegates powers to the states. Well, the structure matters because the resources, the technical expertise, the strategic priorities, the political affiliations, all of these things at the state and local level matter and influence how data is collected. So I've kind of given this big high level overview of all these changes, and I think it's pretty obvious by this point that just based off the recommendations of this committee, some of the barriers or some of the issues associated with the data infrastructure that we have in the US that relates to firearm ownership and use and injury and public health, it could stand to be improved. Okay, what's this mean? I just gave a to-do list of possible things that we could do, and I'm again not advocating for it, but let's say if we don't do anything, let's say the status quo remains. Well, let's remember that infrastructure tends to have very high costs and it requires collective action to build. So if we're trying to do something at scale, like say build an interstate highway system, that's expensive. So that's part of the reason the federal government got involved and chose to build it. Building out data infrastructure of this sort is arguably pretty similar. A lack of federal action or a lack of action among major actors that can kind of coordinate among all these different entities and stakeholders that all have a stake in gathering this data. Basically without having somebody to do that or serving that function, it means responsibility falls to state and local governments or individual nonprofits. And that's basically the state of where we are today. The existing fragmentation that we have is largely a result of us employing this approach nationally. So it makes communication and coordination and data collection difficult, partially because of the high costs. And let's say we continue down this path. Well, the effect on policy, I can't say what that is, but as we know, there are known knowns, there are things we know, and we also know there's known unknowns, and that is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. Well, I don't necessarily know what not collecting better, improved data, what effect that would have on public policy. I simply don't know. I don't know the political calculations. I don't know how everybody who looks at this issue would handle it. And I think that's really hard to say. But one thing I do know is that effective public health policy does require good data, and regardless of how we see firearms and regardless of how we see all these sorts of issues, sometimes you have to know and understand things in order to approach them in a way that brings about good. All right, so I'm going to wrap up now and then we can discuss, or you can ask me questions that you might have. But I began this presentation by talking about racial inequity in policing, and I don't have a clear solution. This is a deep, intractable problem. It's connected to things like slavery and the historical roots of systemic discrimination, and arguably they're the original sin of the U.S., the Republic. It's something that we today look back on and go, yeah, that was not right or just. And there have been efforts to move things in a more positive direction, but also kind of going back historically, we had the Second Amendment and a culture of gun ownership in the United States. And for better or worse today, like a lot of things, gun violence and injury is disproportionately borne by Blacks and other vulnerable demographic groups. Sometimes this has to do with crime. Other times it has to do with mental health and accidents. And then there's much more here that we don't know. And to conclude, I just say to heal that, or at least promote public health more generally, at least given the way that I understand public health, we arguably need better information. And hopefully today I've done a good job of describing some of the gaps in the systems that we have in place to collect that data. Thank you. I see a question from Kelly. She says, there have been some efforts regarding infrastructure and public health that have opted for regionality, groups of states, for example. What are your thoughts on this as a path forward? Kelly, I think that's actually a really good idea, and I had never thought of it that way. I think something like that may be what we see, especially if there's a lot of political gridlock or if there's not consensus nationally about how to handle this. I think that basically a way for some places to approach this would be, regional groups of states to basically enter into some sort of compact and work together. Now, the challenge of that is, could they work with the federal government or not? Would they want to? What does that sort of system look like? And I don't know. I think that would be probably welcomed in some states, like among some groups. There might be other states that wouldn't feel like they have as much of a need. I would argue that the stereotypes about firearm use and injuries are sometimes misleading. Injuries happen everywhere, rural areas and urban ones. But yeah, I think a regional approach could work. It wouldn't address everything nationally, but it's one way to move the needle if we simply wanted to collect more data. And I think that sort of approach could be nice. Megan, you ask, are there comparable data where we're lacking data due to law, culture, maybe in agriculture? So I can say in terms of law, that's actually an issue. And I just know this because there's a data set that previously was hosted in my archive, and it still is, but newer instantiations of it are actually hosted directly by the courts in Washington, D.C. It's the USAOC. I can't remember what it stands for, but essentially it's statistical information collected about courts. And there's some questions about which group or entity should provide this data, whether it should be the judicial branch or the executive branch or some combination of the two. And complicating matters, every state has different approaches for court data. I know Missouri, where I grew up, has, it's called MoCaseNet. So it's basically all public court filings for the state. It's an old system, but it does work. But I don't think there's a comparable equivalent in Michigan that I've been able to find. So yeah, there are some challenges. In terms of culture, geez, I'm sure that's the case there. And in agriculture, that's actually really interesting. I don't know about agriculture. I know the USDA collects some really good data, but I'm not familiar enough with how agriculture works there. My sneaking suspicion is agriculture is probably fairly well examined just because USDA works closely with farms and rural communities. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on there. Rural communities often depend on agriculture, as an economic revenue stream. And yeah, lots of it's my property. I don't want other people to know what I do with it. I bet you there is. In that case, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some questions there. And I'm sure there are all sorts of politics, but I know at the same time, because of the, there are farm subsidies, and there is, at least going back to the 30s, federal policies in place that tries to provide aid to rural areas, that connects to it too. Economics does help with ag. Okay. Yeah, so I don't know as much in that area, but I can see it being kind of similar. And I definitely could see it being influenced by the individual states too, because some states are more agricultural than others.
Cool. And we have one question in the doc. To the extent that capturing ownership amounts to a registry, can you comment on what value there would be to an infrastructure that doesn't capture ownership?
So I think maybe the value in something like that is, let's say you did have a registry that didn't capture ownership, but it did trace like whether a firearm was found in multiple locations, so let's say you find it in one case and it was, it originated in one location, right? And then you find out it was used in I don't think this would actually happen, but let's say it was used in a crime like 5 states away or something like that, and it was left at the scene. And you don't necessarily know who bought it or anything like that. You would at least know, okay, it was found at one place and it went to another one. So there's some sort of linkage there. So you could look at that. I think if a gun was used in multiple crimes, and if it wasn't connected to individuals, you'd be able to deduce that there's some sort of probably linkage, or some sort of connection between the crimes. But beyond that, I don't know. I don't know from a practical perspective how that would actually work, because I can only assume that if the police take possession of a firearm, they're not going to resell it. Though that may be the case. I don't know. Yeah, and this is one of the big challenges, I think, of just dealing with this issue is there are a lot of questions about what you can use data for and what you can and what questions you can ask for. So sometimes you have to have data to be able to formulate hypotheses or figure out what you can do. But on the other hand, sometimes you need to come up with methodology and identify a need for something and come out and then build out the infrastructure. So there's this kind of tension between collecting things just in time versus just in case. And I think that's part of the tension here too. If you over collect, you do run the risk of that data becoming publicly available. But if you under collect, you run the risk of people not necessarily knowing what they need or being able to experiment or sort around a little bit, or just not necessarily knowing what's available. And that's the challenge. I wish I had a good answer to that. I'm sure there's somebody out there who studies this who actually knows a little bit more about what specific research questions could be answered with a registry of the sort you talked about.
Do you know, kind of like a follow-up on that, can this data be treated similarly to PHI, as in, if you talk to researchers who work with PHI, I'm wondering if they would have the same knowledge, how much do you need to answer X research question?
Mm-hmm. My sense is that'd probably be a really good community to engage with. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I think the public health community and people who work with PHI in general, might know a little more than the criminology community, just for the fact that, when people get convicted of a crime, a lot of that's a public record. There's certain things that are provided public as just part of ongoing transparency associated with the legal process and, people being tried and convicted in the court of law. there are some instances where data is not provided in criminology, and there are definitely restrictions. Things about prisoner data, instances where there's fear of retaliation against individuals who, answer a survey or like provide information from in prison. But it's not structured quite the same as it is in public health or with public personal health information. So I think that'd be a really good area to look.
Yeah, and I know in Michigan Medicine, at least, the group that manages our research health data is also starting to integrate data sets from the state. And I'm just like, can we just copy paste some of that? So.
Yeah, and yeah, like getting them from the state, I think would be particularly useful. I think there are probably some sampling strategies that might even be possible, like out there. Like if you were able to just find a couple of states that had particular census tracts or areas that like could mirror representation within the US, that might be an approach to to collect data without necessarily having to increase risk to everybody, or just have to make it where people don't have to worry about some big brotherly registry of information out there. But again, these are all questions that it's easier to identify problems and solutions, and then getting the money to pay for a solution is on a whole different level there too. So yeah. And Amy, I see your comment here about the known unknowns and the data feminism piece. Yeah, we definitely did that on purpose. It's actually something that informed my presentation today. I was thinking a lot about that and the gaps in terms of what we don't know, because really that's kind of the issue here. It's is what we don't know something that's good, or is it something that's perceived as a threat? If we were to know, that could be easily turned into a political issue. But anyway, I digress.
Do you think there would be value in just kind of crowdsourcing the data gathering, just one research group doing it for their city, and then just eventually collecting them all?
Yeah, so I've actually thought of this. So if this were to be crowdsourced, there are certain groups that kind of do something similar. So the Gun Data Archive, I don't know their exact methodology in terms of how they collect their information, but they do something similar. They try and collect it from individual municipalities. The scale of the problem, though, I think really needs to be an issue. Yeah, reporting bias is an issue. Quality control is definitely an issue. The availability of data is going to be an issue too, not even necessarily looking at representation. I'm thinking of just who's going to be able to provide it or not. Like my parents live in a rural county in southwestern Missouri, and the county isn't particularly wealthy. It's a good place to live, but they have limited resources. And, if they were given a choice on what they're going to spend money on, whether it's going to be, elite increased enforcement, or law enforcement, or paying for roads, or helping with schools, or, building out, an online system to share this information, they're probably going to focus on kind of the more basic things. And so if you had a crowdsourced approach, you're going to miss some of that. You'd go out and you'd see, oh, well, nothing's there. And it's just because they don't have the resources or technical know-how or time to collect this, and they may not care that much about it because it may not even be the biggest issue that they're facing. So that's where I think the federal government and the resources come into play. And I'm not saying this has to be an entirely a federal issue, but there are reasons why kind of a central national approach is often kind of viewed favorably. It's because it just makes things easier. So, but that said, I don't know, there may be some other ways to crowdsource that I don't know about.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of like all the researchers I help. We've got a number who are working on like multi-site data repositories for health information, and
Mhm.
it doesn't involve doesn't usually or doesn't have to involve other institutions. Like some patients will just readily contribute their data.
Mhm.
Um, And I'm also thinking about some of the national infrastructure we have. Like we have uh oh shoot, I'm blanking on the name. What's open source storage grid? Is that the right name?
The open storage network.
That one. Yeah, we've got the open storage network, we've got the open science grid that kind of works with it. So we have like this distributed compute and storage infrastructure there once the data set exists, and it could help people analyze it.
Yeah.
And at least on the ID side, we've also done a lot with data enclaves to help deal with sensitive data. It's just getting that data in the first place.
Right, and that my impression seems to be that's the issue here. So like, I mean, data enclaves and providing access and having clear, strict rules in place to protect people's information. Like, I think that's something that can be done. Collecting it and making people trust those systems and understand all the complexities associated with them, that's more difficult. So like Megan, for example, you bring up the question of whether this would be a FOIA topic. So my understanding is that in this sort of case, I think it wouldn't be, especially if it had like, there are certain FOIA exemptions. Maybe I'm wrong. I'd have to go back and actually look at it, but there are some exemptions. But that's a really technical response. You have somebody who lives in a rural area, or someone in an urban area for that matter too, who's like very resistant to the idea of gun control and cares a lot about their right to own firearms. They may not necessarily understand that, not everything that the government has can't be or FOIA, or that there are restrictions, and vice versa. So this is where it gets really nitpicky and hair splitty, and it's really difficult to not only build the system, but also communicate the protections that people have and ensure, make people feel comfortable with it, which is, I think, really where a lot of this comes down to. It's comfort and an understanding that, the point of this would be to find ways to identify problems. This isn't a gun confiscation scheme. So that's a challenge. So anyway.
Any more questions?
Okay.
No more questions. All right. Thank you all for coming. And we will not see you next month, but we'll see you January.
It's been a pleasure to speak
I'll
to
see
you
you
guys
at the
today.
party.